Welcome back. We all know someone impacted by COVID in some way, whether it be through experiencing a loss of a loved one or being a survivor of the virus. COVID Survivors for Change seeks to share those stories with the world. Joining us now to share more is Chris Kocher, founder and executive director of COVID Survivors for Change. Welcome, Chris. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So please tell us about COVID Survivors for Change and your mission.
Sure. We're a national nonpartisan movement. And what we're doing is working together to bring Americans who have been impacted by the virus. So that means they've lost a loved one, they've survived the virus themselves, and bringing them together to build community and to help them speak out to make sure the communities, have the funding, have the resources, have the leadership in place to address not just this current pandemic, but also future public health emergencies.
Thank you for sharing. So, COVID Survivors for Change recently held a national movement and marched here in Brooklyn Bridge with New York nurses and hundreds of people. Can you share more about this march?
Yeah, absolutely. It was really inspired by a young woman, Hannah Ernst. She's 16 years old in New Jersey, and her grandfather had passed away from COVID. She founded an art exhibit organization called Faces of COVID Victims. She's drawn, more than 2,000 portraits of people who have died from COVID. And she had last year had planned to walk across the Brooklyn Bridge with her grandfather. And sadly, he got sick and died from COVID before they were able to do that. So she decided that she wanted to walk across the bridge to honor his life, to honor the lives of every victim from COVID and every survivor of COVID. And so we were really honored to work with her and her organization, Faces of COVID Victims, and the Yellow Heart Memorial, and really more than 15 other partner groups, including, as you mentioned, the New York State Nurses Association, to bring together hundreds of people to walk safely across the bridge to talk about what the ongoing needs of the survivor community are, and the kids who have lost parents to COVID, what they need, the long haulers, what they need, and really just to continue to raise awareness that COVID is not over and we have more work to do, not just to end this pandemic, but to support the people who have been devastated by it.
Chris, you mentioned the Yellow Heart Memorial. Can you tell us about the memorial and also the significance of yellow for COVID-19 survivors?
Yeah, absolutely. The Yellow Heart Memorial is a national grassroots memorial and a nonprofit that was started by a woman, Rosie Davis, who lives in Texas. And her mother died from COVID. And she really wanted to create something to humanize every person who has died from COVID and to put a name and a face to the number, right? So the Yellow Heart was something that started in England. And then Rosie took it here and said, let's take the Yellow Heart, which has become this universal symbol of COVID loss and survival. Let's add names to it so that we can talk about not just the numbers of the people who have lost, but their names, their stories, their faces, the lives that they've lived, and the impact that they left behind. So it started with a memorial in her backyard earlier this year, and now has grown to, this nationwide movement to call for memorialization and memorials for COVID victims all over the country. And they've displayed, thousands of yellow hearts. They have 8 chapters and are growing and have done incredible work to help people in their own communities memorialize their loved ones and invite the community to step into a space to support them and to honor those that have been taken.
This sounds like a movement really led by empathy and understanding of each other is often something that we don't know is talk about our grief and our trauma throughout this past year. Things have happened so fast.
Yeah.
Is there a memorial here in New York, Chris? Do we know?
There are plans. They have been working on one. I know that the city had worked on plans. I think what we'll see, hopefully what we'll see is, because what we know from this pandemic is that it has devastated families in every single community all across America. And so my hope is that we'll see not just memorials at the national level in Washington, D.C., but memorials in cities and states all across the country, cities like New York City, which was that awful first epicenter of the pandemic last year, to really make sure that people not just have a place to know that this is being honored at the national level in Washington, D.C., but also have a place in their own community where they can go to and honor their loved ones.
Absolutely. So none of us, of course, were prepared for this pandemic, and everyone knows someone who has passed away from COVID-19 or has been affected in one way or another. I know that the group acknowledges the impact this pandemic has had on all of us collectively. How is COVID Survivors for Change advocating for all through policy change in particular?
Yeah, and you make a really good point. I mean, so many people have been impacted by this. Thankfully, I have not had COVID, and no one in my immediate family has. But in talking to all the broader community who has, we know firsthand that this community needs more support. So for the resources and the programs that have been passed to support the broader American public, let's make sure that those resources are going directly to the families and the survivors who have been impacted, so they have access to healthcare, mental health resources. We've worked for pushing for paid leave for all. The United States is one of only handful of countries who do not have paid leave. So we want to make sure that we push for that as well. And that's something that could, as soon as it's impacted, start really having a material impact on families. Supporting the children who have lost a parent. There's studies that have shown that 43,000 children have lost a parent. And so, what are we doing to show up to support them, not just now, but for the lifetime of grief and healing that they have to wrestle with? Some of those families have lost homes. And so, let's make sure that we're showing up to provide mental health resources as they go back to school next month. How are we making sure that the schools are a safe and supportive environment for them, even as direct as financial scholarships, so that they don't have to worry about college down the road. And then finally, making sure, like we said, that supporting the mission of groups like Yellow Heart Memorial to make sure that we memorialize those who have died and make sure that this never happens again.
Chris, I'm glad you shared. Fortunately, your family hasn't been affected by COVID, and that's incredible. You, as the executive director and founder, what got you started in founding this organization and doing this work at this time?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I worked for close to a decade in the gun violence prevention movement, and I started the program there that became the Every Child Survivor Network, which is the nation's largest community of gun violence survivors working together to end gun violence. And so when the pandemic hit last year, I began to think, is there something that I can do to support the community like what I've done in the gun violence prevention space? So helping people speak out and share their stories and fight to end gun violence, building community, connecting people to support and resources. And so I really felt like this was something of a similar mission. And like you said earlier, anchored in empathy. So I jumped into this to help build out programs to do the same thing. So, we've run survivor summits to bring people together and to bring in outside experts to, help people think about how they can share their story to make a difference, building community, connecting people, online, and hopefully once it's safe to do so in person, which actually that was a big part of the mission for the march, was just to give people who have, for more than a year been working together virtually and on Zoom, that space to be together safely in person. And then building programs to connect people to the support resources that they need. So we run a weekly support group called COVID Connections, where we bring in mental health professionals who, have expertise in grief and trauma to have access, so people have access to, on a regular basis, that weekly support. We've run groups for Spanish language speakers, for long haulers. We've brought in child psychology experts to talk to the parents who have either lost a co-parent or lost a child, to help them build the support network that they need and the knowledge about how to support themselves and their family. Looking ahead to back to school, again, bringing in some of those experts to talk to these families to say, here are really concrete and specific ways that you can support not just your children going back to school, but yourself as well, as your children return to school, and some of the anxiety and stress that can go with.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing. That was definitely going to be my next question about the resources and services, and you kind of just gave it to me all in one. So are the resources still available to families online? Are there upcoming events or virtual summits that people can attend? Chris, can you share?
Yeah, absolutely. If you go to our website, www.covidsurvivorsforchange.org, you can also email us at info@covidsurvivorsforchange.org. But on that website, there is a drop-down spot for trauma resources and survivor resources, and you can click right in there and sign up for COVID Connections. We do it just about every single Thursday. We've been doing it almost for a full year now, and it really is just important for people to have, whether you need it or not, that specific week, just knowing that every single week you have a safe space to connect with mental health professionals. We do about 10 to 15 minutes of learning about some aspect of trauma or PTSD or complicated grief. And then we break out into small groups to have facilitated discussions about the material and just to see how people are doing. So it's been not just an important space for people to learn about what their trauma and their pathway with grief has been, but also to connect with others who have that shared experience, so that they can see where other people are and learn from them, and also share what's been working or to ask questions to the broader group about what they can do to support themselves.
I'm so happy to hear that it's also available in Espanol for our Spanish speaking community as well. Thank you
Absolutely.
for
It's
sharing
so
that.
important. Yeah. And that group is every Monday evening at 9 p.m. Eastern. And again, we think that's really important that, regardless of the language you speak, that you have access to the same level of resources and support. So you can sign up for that as well on the website.
Yes, thank you, Chris. So today we do have a doctor on the show talking about, back to school and preparing children physically and mentally for
Yeah.
back to school. Can we just elaborate a little more on just the importance of, being present for our children, not just physically, but, mentally preparing to transition back from a year, of remote learning?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that regardless of where you are and what this past year has been like for you, it's been an emotional year. And so for children to go back to school who maybe lost a loved one, I mean, especially here in New York City, there's catastrophic information about the number of children who have lost a parent, a caretaker, a loved one who lived with them, perhaps. And so that number is many, many times higher than it would have been in a typical year. So understanding that under the best of circumstances children have had a difficult year, and then to understand that many a very high percentage of these children have lost someone, sadly an increasing number of children may be returning to school with long COVID themselves, and certainly with the Delta variant continuing to spread, that's going to be an ongoing concern. So how can we make sure that as children return to school, not just that the classroom is safe, we have all the testing in place and the ventilation, all the things that are required in masking to make sure that the classroom is safe, but how can we make sure that children's mental well-being is safe as well? And so that means really helping parents understand how they can be advocates for their own children, to the school board, to in their child's classroom, and really helping teachers understand what the unique needs of these children may be, so that they understand that every child is coming into the classroom with a different and potentially very emotional experience over the past year. And so making sure that we're giving really concrete ways that teachers can support the kids as well through IEP plans and 504 plans and all the other mechanisms, to make sure that the children and the families know that the school has a psychologist on site, and actually maybe encouraging or requiring a consult or a conversation with the school psychologist. All the mechanisms that are in place, not just so that we're building those mechanisms, but also that the families know about it as well.
Thank you so much, Chris, for joining us today and sharing more about COVID Survivors for Change. These conversations, I'm sure, are happening on your platform as well. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for having this conversation.
Of course. So you can visit covidsurvivorsforchange.org for more information. We'll be right back here on Open BXRX Tuesday.